verses in Ecclesiastes that a lot of people know by heart when he says, say not, why were the former days better than these, for it is not from wisdom that you ask this. And so looking at the fact that wisdom isn't just about, in fact, wisdom recognizes that we don't dwell on the past. It's not, why were the former days better than these, or, what we, in our modern vernacular, it's, the good old days. Why were the good old days better than these days? And we do admit that there were some things in the past that were better than things today, right? Even though he says this, we understand that Solomon doesn't mean that nothing in the past was ever better than what we have today. Of course, we could go line by line and pick things that were better in the 1920s than today, right? Or the 1950s, or we can pick a few items here and there. But his point is trying to compare the now and the then doesn't help us adapt to the now. And that's what we need to be doing, is adapting our lives to the now. We don't live in 1950 anymore. We live in 2020. And as a result, we have to learn how to live here. And, trying to apply the principles of 1950 or 1980 or whatever day you want to pick as the good old days, to the modern life, we recognize things are different, right? And, it doesn't do us any good to learn how to live in 1980 when it's 2020. We live today, and that's why he's saying it's not from wisdom that you ask, why are the former days better than these? That's not a wise question. The wise question would rather be, how do we live today? And so we finish that, and we come then to verse 11. Wisdom is good with an inheritance, an advantage to those who see the sun. For the protection of wisdom is like the protection of money, and the advantage of knowledge is that wisdom preserves the life of him who has it. And so there's a little bit of question about exactly how to translate verse 11. If the ESV is correct, which is what we have here, wisdom is good with an inheritance, then what we see is that family wealth, or that inheritance, is something that is desirable, but only if it comes with wisdom. In other words, to have a family inheritance left to you, and if you're a fool, you'll blow through it, very quickly, spend it on the wrong things, or make bad decisions with it. Well, we won't get into that on this particular point. So the Bible actually never views poverty in and of itself as an inherent blessing. The Bible often talks about those who are in poverty, that they may have things like they often have better understanding, or they might have a better attitude. That they better attitudes toward wealth. They have better relationships or something like that. But it's the person, understand, who makes those decisions. It's not the poverty that makes those decisions. And so it's not that wealth is inherently bad or poverty is inherently good. It's how we respond in those situations that makes something good or something bad. So you have those who are very wealthy and who respond to that wealth in a good and righteous manner, and God is pleased with that. And you also have those who are in poverty who have bad attitudes and who respond negatively in unrighteous ways. And God obviously is not pleased with that. And so sometimes, because so often in the Bible it does contrast the lifestyle of the wealthy versus the lifestyle of the poor, that we almost get to this idea that richness or wealth is inherently bad and poverty is inherently good, and it's not. And so this idea here, wisdom is good with an inheritance, the idea of wealth that is passed from one generation to the next generation. So the idea that wisdom can be good. On the other hand, the first line here, translated wisdom is good with an inheritance, can also, and some translations have it, wisdom is as good as an inheritance. And so now it's a comparative, that it's that inheritance, when we think about inheriting from our parents or things like that, there's a certain value, a certain good things in that. And he says wisdom is as good as inheritance. Listen, as a parent, if you don't have money to leave to your children, you could still leave them a legacy of wisdom and righteousness. And that's as good an inheritance as anything else they might receive. And so that kind of changes the meaning a little bit. You think about an inheritance, and wisdom lingers generation after generation, like wealth and an inheritance might. Wisdom, like an inheritance, comes from the Lord, Deuteronomy 4 and verse 21, or James chapter 1 and verse 5. If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all men liberally and upbraids not, as the old King James would say. Wisdom, like an inheritance, is to be greatly desired. Proverbs 3:13 through 18 talks about how we should desire that inheritance and desire to leave an inheritance to our children. Now, normally, and I think the Bible even indicates this as well, that inheritance generally is money. But I think what we're seeing here is that the possibility that the inheritance, a good inheritance, isn't always monetary. Sometimes it's the wisdom. Wisdom, like an inheritance, should be the inalienable possession of the people of God. And so if we are wise with our finances, we would be able to leave an inheritance to our children and our grandchildren. And even if it's not in our finances, at least we can leave a legacy of wisdom to them. I like that. I like that whole idea. So in verse 12, he says that for the protection of wisdom is like the protection of money. The purifying process of God leads the wise man's trials to an end that is more glorious than we ever envisioned. That when we follow the wise ways through our trials, notice Solomon doesn't say, the wise man doesn't face trials. The wise man is going to face hardship and struggles. But as we go through them and we rest in the shadow of wisdom, like the shadow of money, that there's something better on the other side of it. And think about all of these Proverbs so far. Remember, we're still in that section of chapter 7 of the Proverbs. A good name is better than precious ointment. The wisdom that he's giving down through these verses. And he comes to this one and he says the protection of wisdom. There's that common theme, wisdom and folly. Wisdom, the protection of wisdom is like the protection of money. Some translations have shadow, the shadow of wisdom and the shadow of money. And some people have read that and said, well, look, here it sounds like he's saying that wisdom and money are of equal value. And that's not really what he's saying. He's saying that there is protection that comes from wisdom, right? When the stove's hot, wisdom, says don't stick your hand on the hot plate, right? There's protection in that, right? Look, is there protection in money? Any of you have car insurance? Home insurance? Any of you have locks on your doors? See, money can buy a certain amount of protection. Can it protect you from everything? No. Can wisdom protect you from everything? No. But there's certain advantages in the protection that comes from money and from wisdom. The advantage of knowledge, he goes on, is that wisdom preserves the life of him who has it, right? Every once in a while, you see these videos online of teenage boys or young men doing stupid things. And by stupid, I mean stupid. They've got their selfie stick in their phone and they're running on the edge of a 40-story building, just right there. Because why'd you look at Colton, Dale? Yeah, I mean, but listen, wisdom doesn't go to the roof of a 40-story building unless it has to, and if it does, wisdom stays away from the edge, right? Foolishness is the one that gets right on the edge and runs at full speed to the corner and tries to stop and turn when the building makes a stop and turn. There are people who really do that. We call them thrill seekers, but they do it once. Some do. But the idea that knowledge, the advantage of knowledge is that wisdom preserves the life of him who has it. Tim?
There's a point here that I think we've missed. Solomon throughout has said, under the sun. Under the sun. But he's got a little take on it here, an advantage to those who see the sun. They're not dead.
That's
They
true.
still have the time to make a change. And I think that needs to be brought into play here, because wisdom, if you're not willing to apply it, is of no advantage. Same way with money. If you squander your money, what advantage has it been to you? And wisdom comes into play all the way through, but you have to be alive to apply it.
Absolutely. I think one of the points that Solomon is making here is that he's really kind of a lot of people say down on life itself. I think what what people would say today is Solomon's getting real. The idea of authentic living, the idea that he recognizes that life under the sun is it's unfair, it's unjust, it's inequitable. We don't always get what we want, things like that. We understand that. And so the idea is that, you might think, well, life must be terrible. I'll end it all. And Solomon says, no, wait, there are some advantages to life under the sun. But ultimately, the best that life under the sun can do for you is lead you to the end of life under the sun. If that's all we're going to, that secular mind, it can't get you past life under the sun. It's the wisdom of God that ultimately does that. And he gives us glimpses throughout the book, and of course the ultimate conclusion at the end of the book, reveals that as the truth. Jennifer?
Well, the whole nature of an inheritance goes to those who are after you. And so the advantage for those who see the sun would be to the children, the grandchildren, and so on, if they use it with wisdom.
Yeah. And that's the idea. So the legacy you're leaving, wisdom, I would say even an example of righteousness, an example of Christian service. We can certainly Christianize the whole context and say, from our perspective in the church, that if we are Christians and we are leaving that legacy to our children, that we've taught them and they've obeyed the gospel, and then they leave it to their children and their children and then their children. And that's ultimately, what every Christian parent wants to be able to do. It doesn't always happen that way, but, that's what we want to be able to do. Because we're living life with a view over the sun. And that's that point. So consider the work of God, who can make straight what he has made crooked. In the day of prosperity, be joyful. In the day of adversity, consider God has made the one as well as the other, so that man may not find out anything that will be after him. Now, here's kind of the conclusion of that section of the Psalms, of the wisdom and folly of death and life, is that we're to consider the work of God, that God is in control, and all of the inequities of life are a result of really God's design and creation and the sustaining of the world. Did God know when the world changed in the Garden of Eden that life would be unfair for some people? Well, surely he did, right? Death itself is one of the things that we look at and say, well, that's unfair, right? We don't like those that we love and those that we care about dying, and we consider it almost an affront to us that death is even here. But that's part of the world that was created after the fall in the Garden of Eden. And so instead of crying over things that we cannot change, we ought to focus on what we do have control over. Who can quarrel with God and point out his errors in the creation? God, you should have made leaves bright blue instead of green. Right? We're not going to look at that and say, well, that's God, you shouldn't have created tornadoes and hurricanes and flash flooding. God, you shouldn't have done those things. Who are we to look at God and point out errors or to straighten out what he has made crooked? This idea of crooked. It's not. It's crooked by our perspective and our point of view. We as human beings have a limited sight knowledge, and we expect things to go straight this way. And the problem is the world doesn't actually work by our expectations. Things don't always go as we planned.
And we can only see about 2 inches beyond the end of our nose.
Absolutely.
Because with the forest fire comes a rebirth of all of those plants, afterwards. And it acts as a fertilizer to them. So God has a plan that's far beyond what we can comprehend.
Absolutely. When did God start answering your prayers? You've got cancer, and now you're praying that your cancer will go into remission. When did God start answering that prayer? Before you were ever born. Before you were, there's a moment in the life of David where, because he numbered the people, and Joab said, "This is not a good idea, man. Don't do this." No, I need to know how many fighting men I've got, David said. So they start numbering the men. And a plague comes, right? And the plague is coming at the hand of a destroying angel. And God stops the angel for a moment. And what he tells David is, pray that this plague may be stopped. What's interesting to me is he tells David to pray that the plague would be stopped after he was already stopped the plague at the angel. God started answering that prayer of David before David ever prayed that prayer. So we see, as Reed said, we see 2 inches of the whole. We don't see the whole. If all of history, were contained, in this circle, there's us. That's what we know. That's our knowledge. That's the limits of our knowledge right there. And that's if we live long, long lives. That's it. But that circle represents all the knowable. And God knows all of that. And God is manipulating those laws of nature. God is manipulating things to bring about, good things for us. We often refer to it as providence, right? What's the root word for providence? It's from the Latin vitae. Huh? Well, provide, but let's go even further back. Huh? It's vitae, vision. We say provisions. Vitae. So provision is to what? What does the prefix pro mean? Before. Before, it's to see beforehand. Does God see beforehand what we already need? Yeah. He has a vision for what we need. And his providence is seeing those needs long before we'll ever see them and starting in motion those events that will bring us what we need at the right time. Ultimately, we see that in Christ, right? When he said all the way back in the garden, I will put enmity between your seed and her seed. Right? You shall bruise, or he shall, you shall bruise his heel, and he shall bruise or literally crush your head. That's what he's telling the devil. There's going to be enmity, hatred, conflict between your offspring, the devil's offsprings, and this woman's seed, Zerah, which, by the way, is the only place in the Bible where Zerah, seed, is seen from coming from the woman. Right? Because man carries the seed. Physically speaking, man carries the seed. But this is the one place where the woman's seed is spoken of. Why? What's the significance of the woman's seed? Well, who is the woman's seed? Jesus. Absolutely. And that was a virgin birth, right? There was no male seed involved. And so it was the woman's seed. Even there in the Garden of Eden, in man's most desperate moment, when sin entered in the world and death through sin, God is making provision. He's seeing down the stream of time. As Romans 5 would tell us, in due season, at just the right time, when everything was right according to God's plan, that seed would burst onto the scene of this world, and through him, all nations of the earth would be blessed. Isn't that a beautiful concept? It's not at all what we're talking about in Ecclesiastes, but man, I love that concept of the seed and how God made provisions all the way down the stream of time. And so this idea is that when we see just a little bit, we're not the ones who are going to straighten out what we think is crooked. One man's winter is another man's summer, right? You know, we're going through winter here, but on the other side of the world, you know, they're going through their summer. A tornado in Oklahoma makes for a good planting season in Haiti, right? The old argument, the butterfly effect. You know, will a butterfly flapping its wings will it cause enough of a swirl of a wind to, affect this and affect that and affect this until eventually mountains are moved and the earth is quaked. The idea that just because something bad, from our perspective and maybe natural disaster-wise happens here in Brighton, are there good things that come of that? Certainly, different weather patterns in different parts of the world. And so we what he's telling us is, look, in the day of prosperity, be joyful, and in the day of adversity, consider that God has made one as well as the other. It's all his. The famed serenity prayer. Lord, give me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. We will have good days and we'll have bad days. A few weeks ago, I think it was Naomi pointed this out. God created all of them. God created every one of them. Good days and bad days. When they're good, he says, rejoice. Be thankful that they're good days. And when they're bad, remember that God has made everything, good and bad. He has control, and we may not know every reason for why things turn out the way they do, but good things come out of adversity. And all things work together for good for those that love the Lord. God, whose law it is that he who learns must suffer. And even in our sleep, pain that cannot forget falls drop by drop upon the heart. And in our own despair, against our will, comes wisdom to us by the awful grace of God. Aeschylus, the Greek tragedian, wrote those words. Pain that drops on us even while we sleep. It brings about this wisdom by the awful grace of God. What does he mean by the awful grace of God? What do you think he meant when he wrote the awful grace of God? Because when we think of grace, do we often modify it with the word awful? Don't we normally celebrate and rejoice in the idea of the grace of God, and we think about it as, the overcoming of our sins, and there but for the grace of God go I, and all these wonderful, and Aeschylus says the awful grace of God. And I think it's because he realizes that grace that God gives, which, remember, grace literally is the idea of gift. God gives these gifts to us, and sometimes those gifts hurt, right? When you discipline a child, does it hurt? But is it for their own good? That's the awful grace of parenting. Terry, do you have?
When I look at awful, I think about painful, like you said, and I think about His grace on the cross, laying His life down for us. And that's where wisdom comes from. When we're suffering, we look at His suffering.
Yeah, that's a good point. If you're going to take that idea of Aeschylus saying the awful grace of God and wisdom coming through, what better illustration is that than the cross itself? It is awful that God's Son had to hang there for sins not His own, and yet that was the grace of God. First, Joanne.
Well, when you said that, I was thinking in a different direction totally. It's full of awe. Not awfully, but full of awe.
Okay.
Of what God has made.
Yeah.
And no one can straighten what God has bent. Or no one can bend what God has straightened.
And the pot doesn't say to the potter, "Why'd you make me like that? I wanted two handles." Man, you. First, here.
Well, and why do we discipline kids? To keep them out of bigger trouble later. God gives us grace so that we can avoid eternal hell.
Right, to teach them responsibilities and lessons. John?
I kind of went a different direction with the awful thing. I was thinking more kind of a concept that's discussed in the Bible. He who comes last will be first. The concept of if we were alive in the time of Hitler or something like that, he decided to repent after all the terrible things he did, where he would still reach him and still cover his sins.
Okay, so, and that might offend our sensibilities. And so, wait, he doesn't deserve that. And in fact, Jeffrey Dahmer is a perfect example of that. A man that came to Christ after he had killed and a lot of young men and those that he didn't kill, ruined their lives, warped their hearts and minds, and yet at the end of his life he came in humble submission to God and sought forgiveness and obeyed the gospel. And we look at that and it kind of offends our sensibilities. It's interesting, the man who actually went into prison and baptized him, a guy named Ratcliffe, was ostracized by the congregation that he preached for at that time. And around town, people that knew the deeds of Jeffrey Dahmer, they would bar him from going into their stores and places of business because they didn't like what he had done, the awful grace. Terry?
You have to remember Paul and Saul when he was King Paul. Same thing.
Yeah, a lot of the Christians are like, well, isn't this the guy that was just killing us last week? So the awful grace. Amazing stuff. In my life, or in my vain life, he goes on, I've seen everything. And so here's one of those observation clauses that Solomon is so fond of using. I've seen everything. There is a righteous man who perishes in his righteousness, and there is a wicked man who prolongs his life in evil doing. My vain life continues to set life on earth in its proper place. And that's what Tim and I were talking about just a moment ago, about life on this earth versus, something more. It's kind of like that whole treadmill anthem from chapter 1, the monotony of life that continues on and on and on and on. And so the preacher reminds us that life here is empty. Ultimately, it's empty. It ends with a period, and that's all there is. If from the secular mind point, if we're just going to do what we can observe, it ends with a period. Even with the vertical aspect, though, looking toward God, the presence of God, the time here on earth is temporary, and it's fragile, and it's empty in itself. But even if we consider the presence of God, and our accountability to him, there are still dangers. The righteous man, he says, will perish in his righteousness. He is not guaranteed peace and prosperity. And so you get this idea, some people go through struggles and trials of life, and then they go, well, God must be punishing me. Well, it's possible, but it's possible God is simply letting you bear the consequences of your decisions. And if you've made bad decisions, bad things might happen to you. But even if you make the right decisions, every time bad things can still happen to you. Naboth, the Jezreelite, had a vineyard in Jezreel beside the palace of Ahab, king of Samaria. And after this, Ahab said to Naboth, give me your vineyard. 1 Kings 21, verses 1 and 2. Did Naboth sell him his vineyard? No. So what did Ahab do? It says that he went back to his palace and that he pouted. Well, it doesn't use the word pouted, but it says he laid on his bed and he turned his back to everyone. And his lips probably poking out because he didn't get his vineyard. And he's so mad. And you remember Jezebel came in and said, after he's not eating and he's turned his back to the world, Jezebel said, why don't you just take it? You're the king. There's got to be some advantages. It's like advantages to American Express card holders. There's got to be advantages to be the king. You want the vineyard, you take it. Well, he doesn't do it. So she goes out and she hires some men to falsely accuse Naboth of cursing God. And so they put him to death through capital punishment. And guess who gets his vineyard? Ahab. He says that there's the righteous man who perishes in his righteousness, and there is a wicked man who prolongs his life in evil doing. And it from right there in that moment, it appears that the wickedness of Ahab and Jezebel has conquered the righteousness of Naboth. But remember, God does not always settle his accounts in October. The prosperity of the wicked perplexed many of the ancient writers. David said, for example, in Psalm 37, verses 1 and 2, fret not yourself because of evildoers. Be not envious of wrongdoers, for they will soon fade like the grass and wither like the green herb. Asaph pined. He said, truly God is good to Israel, to those who are pure in heart. But as for me, my feet had almost stumbled. My steps had nearly slipped, for I was envious of the arrogant when I saw the prosperity of the wicked. Psalm 73, verses 1 through 3. Or the prophet Habakkuk. Question, you who are of purer eyes than to see evil and cannot look at the wrong, why do you idly look at traitors and remain silent when the wicked swallow up the man more righteous than him? We've struggled with that question for a long time. And I think the reason why is because the answer does not wholly satisfy our need for justice. Oh, I know what happened to Jezebel and Ahab. Not everyone got to see that day. Think of those who saw that tragedy happen and then died before equity was brought into the world again. Joanne?
A moment ago, you said that God, people that say, why is God punishing me? Did you said that he does do that, or?
Yes, I think that he does that through letting us bear the consequences of our decisions, yes.
I guess my view on that when I was looking at it was the fact that God does not bring, bad things on us because we all sin and we all make mistakes.
Right.
And it's by his grace that we can be clean again.
Absolutely.
And I just don't know that, and I may be totally wrong, but I just don't know that God saying, I'm gonna punish you, because I have a child that, she wants to do what's right so bad, and that she will say, well, I guess because it didn't turn out this way, that God is punishing me. And that is something that I myself can't believe that God would do. We're his children.
Well, of course, Hebrews 12 tells us specifically, because we are his children, we receive his discipline. And part of that discipline would be corrective punishment at times. I don't think that every bad thing that happens to someone, though, is a result of punishment from God. In fact, I was meeting with a young man earlier this week, and those were his words coming to me was, all these bad things happening to me. He said he's an atheist, and all these bad things have happened to me. Does that mean God is punishing me? I said, well, I don't know. Could it be? Some of the things are punishment? Could be, but not everything is a punishment from God. And so, Brother Macias, one of my teachers in school, used to say, is this accidents, coincidence, or providence? And sometimes we just don't know. But it is possible that the discipline of the Lord exhibits itself in bad things that happen to us, but it's also possible bad things happen to us because people are bad, because other people choose to make bad decisions, and we bear the consequences of their decision. Someone murders someone else. It may not have been anything the victim had done. It's the murderer made that decision. And
That's what I was thinking. We make our own bets.
yes,
We do the things that cause us consequences.
right.
I just, in my heart, cannot believe that God is the loving God that he is, that's going to cause me to, punish me for something that I did wrong.
Yeah.
Except in the end, if we don't make that right.
Well,
Not talking about the end.
It's our decision.
it is still our decision, absolutely. Let's see, Naomi?
Well, in Hebrews 12:6, it says that God chastens those who love.
Right. And so God definitely disciplines us. There's definite discipline. And like I said, that can exhibit itself in punishment to us, us bearing the consequences. It's kind of, I think this kind of goes back to that question, Joanne, on Pharaoh's heart. Remember the old question, who hardened Pharaoh's heart? Well, in some passages it says God, and in some passages it says Pharaoh. I think God, by demanding something of Pharaoh, ultimately Pharaoh bucked against that and hardened his heart. Let's see, Becca first, and then John.
When parents give consequences and discipline to their children, we don't think of them as not loving, we think of them as loving.
Right.
And so God, he is loving. And part of
Good
that
point.
love is disciplining us sometimes. And I don't believe we can always know when that is.
Right.
But I do believe that we need to accept it just as parents we offer lovingly, we can offer even tough discipline to children.
Right. John?
I think a lot of times we need to transcend what we perceive as love and justice and all this kind of stuff in our American culture, because we're coddled here, and we have a lot of good, and things are easy for us. We want our kids to have the best. A lot of times whenever we have children, our perceptions change because it's like, oh, now I know what it's like to be a parent. That's the way that God should be. But we have to remember that he sees everything. He created us, but he's above us.
And that goes back to, we put God in a box. What really is that we are in a box. And that with the sides of which are limits of knowledge and understanding and accomplishment and power. We're in a box. And we don't like to be in the box alone, so we reach outside the box where God is, and we try to pull him into our box with us and limit him by the same limitations that we face. And God simply does not face those limitations. Tim first.
We're trying to put everything on God here. God's responsible. But we have another monkey in here that's throwing the wrench at us, and that's the devil. He is still throwing wrenches, he's throwing spears and trying to trick you up. So, we can't say all this is God. God has put a limit on the devil, but he hasn't put him in the box.
Yeah.
He's still out there roaming around seeing whom he can out.
The devil has as much free will as we have.
As we're talking about this life, and that's what Solomon is talking about, is our life right this minute. We have to accept grace in our position, but we also have to accept a punishment. You talk about Dahmer. He received grace. He still had his punishment.
Yeah.
And that's what we go through. And the first line says, everything in my vain life, I have seen everything, period.
Yeah.
And that's what we understand life to be.
Right.
That's what he's trying to get across.
All right. Althea?
I've had to search this out in my heart and mind quite a lot, and I think that God uses things in our life to not only right our ship sometimes, but also to be that example maybe to somebody else that will be in our circle that may make them have a moment of,
To help right their ship.
yeah,
Yeah.
right there.
All right, Bill?
On the other hand, there is great consolation in Romans 8 and verse 1. There is therefore now no condemnation to them
Absolutely.
who are in Christ.
Absolutely.
So if we're in Christ and we strive for that perfection, we can't be perfect, but we strive for it.
Yes.
And we know in our minds that there is no condemnation for us.
Absolutely.
But Tim was right. The devil is out there. He's always after us. So put us down.
Absolutely. Those are great points. Terry, did you have one other comment? And we got to...
Yeah, in the Beatitudes it says, when you're persecuted for righteousness' sake, rejoice, for great is your reward in heaven.
That's right.
So sometimes we're punished not for doing wrong, just because people just say you deserve punishment, doesn't make it right.
No. One thing that Joanne did say earlier that I really appreciate is we all sin. We all deserve punishment. And right now we deserve the punishment. The mercy of God is that we don't get the punishment we deserve. The grace of God is that he gives us even more than we ever do deserve. But certainly we have to understand that our unrighteousness, our sin makes us worthy of punishment. But God holds off on that for the most part. All right. Appreciate your attention.